the strategy consulting firm I joined, I can't resist asking if you were to think about what the strategy for India Inc. ought to be as far as globalization is concerned. What are the key imperatives from your perspective?
India is such a diverse economy, and there are so many opportunities, I think, for Indian companies to continue to develop the market at home. I think my first observation would be that India Inc. needs to be very clear about what it's trying to accomplish by globalizing. I think there have been some motivation for Indian companies to engage in foreign direct investment because there's frustration about how difficult it is to build new businesses here in India, because there are concerns about infrastructure challenges here, and because, frankly, there's a certain wanderlust that all companies get when they get to a certain size, especially when they have lots of free cash. And Indian companies enjoyed a great period of prosperity, very dynamic economic growth here, managed to escape, for reasons both of policy and good fortune, many of the consequences of the financial crisis. And now with of course, the decline in value of the rupee and multiple interest rate adjustments by the reserve banks, and signals that Western credit is going to become tighter, that suggests to me that Indian companies have to be very, very purposeful in designing globalization strategy. Why are they trying to do this? Is it simply to find an outlet for capital, or is it to begin to repatriate intellectual property, technology, etc.? Irrespective of the industry, I think also Indian companies need to be very, very clear about what it's going to take in the entire dimension of human assets to be successful globally. That means everything from how do you take the outstanding talent that Indian companies can access, but make it more, to use a phrase I borrowed earlier, globally friendly, globally relevant, able to be deployed globally. Also, how do you start beginning the process of attracting non-Indians into the management ranks of Indian groups? If you go to sustainably successful global players, a good example would be Philips, and you walk up and down the hall there, where you go to their management conference. The participants, it looks like a meeting of the United Nations. Same thing at General Electric in the United States. So when will we go to Indian management team meetings and see even the beginnings of that type of diversity? A third thing is being very clear about metrics. When I look at the actual performance of some of the big signature deals that Indian companies have done, they're very frequently described in terms of how much bigger they made the company from a revenue line perspective. And that's an interesting way to measure, but you can get endlessly bigger until you go out of business. And so I think really being clear, not simply about financial measures, where some type of stated objective in terms of value creation, return on capital employed is not only determined ahead of time, but that the company holds itself to evaluating how it did relative to that. Not because every deal will always meet that mark, because if you fail to meet that mark, there's an opportunity to learn. Was the mark unrealistic, or did you not execute well? And the next time, are we going to set a more realistic target, or do we need to execute better? But also in getting specific about how one would measure things like repatriating management practice or repatriating intellectual property. I think also that Indian groups, particularly the larger groups, demonstrate all the structural attributes of companies that grew up in autarkic economies. You can see this in Brazil, you can see this in South Africa. You can also see it in China, to somewhat lesser extent. because of the ministerial influence on the definition of business scope in China. But that they tend to be quite diversified, often separately listed, and often, of course, growth very much financed with leverage. So that creates a diversity inside the business group that I think actually poses a barrier to effective globalization. Because if you really want to go and play in these very competitive marketplaces, and you want to do it acquiring companies or assets in this hyper-competitive marketplace for such assets, you're going to have to choose where you want to play, both geographically and within your portfolio. And I think one will see, as one has seen in Korean Chaebol, over time, a narrowing of the global activities to a few areas, and ultimately probably the breakup of some of the groups, or really creating them as purely every top on their own bottom. I think also there's a bit of a false question that gets posed, which is, should India be focusing on the developing world or on the developing world? And the answer is yes. It's not either or. It very much depends on the nature of the industry involved, what type of skills the group actually has relative to incumbent players in those areas, in those markets, and also the appetite for risk. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the whole IT services dimension, India has some brilliantly successful, highly competitive global companies, which are rightly celebrated. But when one looks at those companies and how they carved out their positions, they carved out their positions by bringing hugely talented human capital to marketplace at prices that were a third of those in the United States. It was a classic cost arbitrage play. And they have not enjoyed so much success in more value-added services. If one looks at the diversification of some of the big groups in primary metals like steel and aluminum, the groups like, for example, the Chorus acquisition by Tata, entering into that business was really the acceptance of very considerable risk, which is another thing that has to be carefully studied, as I alluded to earlier. That was acquiring a mature asset with assets in markets that are highly regulated, including their labor markets, and put significant capital in play in low growth areas. And I think the write-down that Tata Group took on Chorus is a reflection of the fact that it could be that their forecast for how those risks would play out ended up being misplaced. No one's good no one's perfect at predicting the future, but one has to view assets from the perspective of how effective the Indian group is going to be in operating, but also what type of market and political risk and other risks occur. Another example would be interests that Indian companies are expressing in Africa. I think we're all excited about improvements in Africa and the number of countries in Africa that are beginning to show more responsible and sophisticated economic governance. But I just point out that when India did its great liberalization in the early 1990s, a showcase of stability and economic opportunity in Africa was the Ivory Coast, and a showcase of dysfunction, civil war, and strife was Ethiopia. It's 20 years later, and those positions are inverted. I think also Indian companies should be very wary of exporting their domestic rivalry. This India Inc. should in some ways think about how is India Inc. going to survive in the global world, including soliciting more active and sincere support by the Indian government in dealing with foreign governments, and perhaps resist the temptation to export feelings of high competitiveness with one another to foreign markets. And I would say if we look back to some of the less successful episodes of globalization, particularly some of the Japanese instances, a final observation would be very wary of big signature acquisitions that have lots of excitement around them because it's a very exciting brand, or because it's famous property, or many other sophisticated global players are pursuing it. I would argue that the most successful models of globalization really are cultivated over a long period of time. The types of assets that the company wants to acquire strategically are known, and companies wait occasionally for decades till those assets become available at an attractive price, and they're very often done on a painful brick-by-brick basis as opposed to one big flashy, media event-driven deal touted by bankers.
Thank you so much, Joe, for sharing your perspectives and your experiences. I think it'll be really interesting to be sitting here in 10 years' time and looking back and seeing what kind of progress India Inc. has made in that journey.
Well, thank you, Ambar, for inviting me, and I'll take that as an invitation for 10 years from now. And as a friend of India, I'm hopeful that we'll have a lot of exciting.
Hopefully, well before 10 years from now. Thank you.